you're quite privileged today. It's myself and Dr. Kat McNicol from BASC that will be presenting. So can I start with saying how fantastic it is that we're having these conversations, and that we all have such a passion for our wildfowl right the way across the flyway, and that if we are going to have be making differences at the scale that we want, this sort of collaboration and evening is fantastic to see. So tonight, Kat and myself will be going in through the detail of what BASC stands for, what BASC stands for in relation to our sustainable shooting approach, because we've undertaken something relatively recent. Kat's going to be leading on the data analysis and the process that we went through, and then I'll take over and cover the implementation, what it is that we have done to try and deliver sustainable shooting in the UK. So I'll start by handing over to you, Kat.
Thank you, James, and good evening, everyone. You might have been sitting here listening to some of the other presentations thinking, well, what can we do? I feel a little bit helpless, and there's birds declining, some of them don't breed in our country. So from this position, you might feel a bit limited by politics, by climate, by uncontrollable factors. So we really want to share with you our story in the UK of change, or our strive towards change in the hunting sector, and our kind of vision for sustainable waterfowl harvest that feels like it's within grasp. So just to set the scene, I think it's important that we cover what sparked or ignited this piece of work to begin with. So although unfortunately the UK are no longer part of Europe from an economic perspective, that doesn't mean that we're ecologically disconnected. We still share a flyway. We're still signatories on to AWA, which is the African Eurasian Waterbird Agreement. We're still governed by the principles of the Birds Directive, and as a result, we're still feeling similar pressure to many of the EU countries in relation to bird harvest, especially with the EU Commission reviewing current harvest and population levels of huntable birds. So a lot of what James and I will talk about today has been guided by and supported by colleagues at FACE, the Federation of European Hunters, that has been made relevant by us and kind of workable within a UK specific context. So this has the potential to be relevant to lots of other countries, but this specifically focuses on what we've done in the UK. And with these reviews, the EU Commission reviews of populations and harvest, we've seen very close to home in the Republic of Ireland the restrictions and limitations that can occur when we aren't part of a process. Governments can be really quick to make restrictive decisions on sometimes limited or poor evidence. And in the Republic of Ireland, we saw 4 species removed from the quarry list. So we saw scaup, common pochard, goldeneye and pintail taken off that huntable species list. So within BASC, the British Association for Shooting and Conservation, we took what I'd like to think is quite a proactive approach to ensure that we were prepared for any suggested changes to the quarry list within the UK. But ultimately, we also wanted to know how sustainable our wild bird harvest was and how we could make it better in a way that didn't require changes to legislation. So what we did internally is we undertook really detailed reviews of each of our quarry species, which considered a whole host of ecological and demographic factors, from reproductive output to migration patterns. So a lot of the information that was presented here by Veli-Matti and by Lena feeds into this evidence database that we created for each species. And this helped us build a picture of the pressures and the threats to understand if and how hunting was fitting into that equation. And of course, this review and the management of wild birds is all about context. We have to be aware of the multiple layers that are involved in bird ecology, in policy and conservation. So initially, we looked at every species at home here in the UK. But as we know, birds are not bound by country borders, and nor is much of our bird legislation. So we also looked at the evidence and any information that we needed around each species on a European or an EU level. But again, birds don't really recognise these political and continental demarcations. So we also had to look at the species on a flyway level, as Klaus discussed. And this is the largest ecological unit that's really relevant for many of our overwintering wildfowl. And finally, we looked at the global status and the global trends for these species. This takes into account other flyway populations, which you will have seen on that map earlier, and pressures that are operating on these species at international levels. So it really was an all-encompassing review of evidence. Now, once we had all of this evidence at our fingertips, we followed a process similar to one that our colleagues at FACE were using to assess the European harvest of bird species, but made it relevant to the UK and used data that we thought the UK government departments would use in their assessment when they reviewed our bird harvest. So this framework, this kind of flow diagram that you can see here, is a simplified version of what we ended up calling our sustainable shooting framework, which we developed to assess all of our quarry species in a really repeatable, systematic way in the UK. So we looked first at the conservation status of a species on a UK level. We then asked, is the species migratory? Because as soon as they become migratory, there are many more influencing factors that can affect that species. We then looked at adult survival. And so, how does that guide the way that the population turns over, and how is the role of hunting important within the kind of dynamics of that population. And finally, we looked at the wintering trends of the birds in the UK. Now, this last bit here, I have obviously said that we think it's important that we work on a flyaway level, but in terms of the way that UK regulation of wildfowling works at the moment, harvest is really regulated on a site-specific level using site-specific trends, which isn't ideal, but we felt that if the government were reviewing this, a good compromise would be looking at the UK level trends rather than flyaway trends. So we were kind of that middle ground between site specific and flyaway specific. So once we'd kind of looked at all of these things for each of our species, the species were then allocated a recommendation. So this middle column here, this recommendation is like a harvest and conservation management recommendation, and they cross a whole spectrum from red. So we need to take action in relation to the way that we harvest and undertake management for the species. So an example here would be for pochard. But the spectrum goes right down to green, where basically it's a much less restrictive recommendation, where we think current harvest and our conservation effort seems really appropriate. And in some cases, for example, with some of our geese species, increased harvest might actually be more appropriate. And many of these recommendations allow for continued shooting, but they may have conditions attached to them. So this might mean providing better bag data. It might be undertaking voluntary restraint, so maybe not shooting as early in the season or shooting a limited number of birds per visit. It might mean prioritising certain sexes, or spending more time on habitat management and predator control. It really depends on which species. And so although there's this framework to get to these recommendations that's very structured, it doesn't mean that each detail for each species is really rigid. There's a lot of flexibility within each of these recommendations for each species, for the way that we manage and we hunt them. Now, I think it's important to note that a lot of this work that I've discussed was done internally at BASC. It's not done, though, in isolation from the people that are impacted by these recommendations. So it's not done in isolation from all the hunters. We not only had a working group within the organisation where staff could add experience, practical experience and detail to our reviews and our recommendations, but we worked closely with our wildfowling liaison committee. This is an appointed cohort of members that represent wildfowl hunters in the UK, and they were really our sounding board for the recommendations for each species and overall, and really productively challenged and interrogated our approach in a way that I think's made this a really rigorous exercise and has given us really usable outcomes. At BASC, we're a membership organisation. It's important that we represent our hunting members while also trying to make positive change, and that's a really fine balance to strike. So I think with the support of the Wildfowling Liaison Committee, we were able to secure an organisation level position on sustainable wildfowl harvest with the organisation's elected council, which may sound like a minor step, but is hugely progressive and a really different way of approaching wildfowl harvest than we have previously. So I realise that's really the nuts and bolts of this work, and I'm going to pass over to James now, who will really pick up this kind of policy position, this framework, in its finished form, and show you how we used it to actually drive action. So James, if I stop sharing.